All right, so today's video was going to be about a mechanical keyboard. I was going to do like a big review about this mechanical keyboard that I've been using, about the sound of the switches and stuff, but it just felt a little bit weird. And so instead, in this video, I'm going to share 5 lessons that I've learned about racism over the years and more recently, in trying to educate myself about it a little more. And point number 1 is the idea of perfectionism. Like, a lot of people I know would have very strong feelings about racism, but a lot of people, including me, it would feel really weird about talking about it because we're not educated enough. There's this, it's one of those excuses that a lot of people use for not talking about political or humanitarian issues because they think, well, I'm not really qualified to talk about this. I'm not an expert in the field of race or whatever the topic would be. And that was a big part of why I wasn't going to do this video. I was thinking that, it'll just be business as usual. There's all sorts of voices out there. Like, what can I really add to the mix? I'm not an expert on the topic at all. But to be honest, I'm reading a book called Me and White Supremacy at the moment. And in it, it talks about this idea of perfectionism as being a very standard excuse as to why people, don't do anything about racism, about white supremacy, about this sort of stuff. And I think for me, on my YouTube channel, I am totally okay with making videos about stuff that I'm not an expert in. I don't pretend to be an expert in anything that I talk about. I review a Microsoft Surface tablet, whatever it's called, without, having not used Windows for 10 years. But for some reason, when it comes to the issue of race, I would feel like, I need to know more about this thing. I need to become an expert in this thing until I can talk about it. And I think that's kind of BS. Like, in a way, it's sort of like trying to find a perfect workout plan and trying to research everything about nutrition before you start even going to the gym. Like, that's clearly not the way to go about it. And obviously, we do need to educate ourselves about all sorts of topics, including race. But I don't think not being an expert in it is a reason to not talk about it. And I know that there are so many people who I'm friends with, who I know online, who haven't talked about these issues for fear that they would get it wrong, or they would offend someone, or they would get cancelled, or they're not an expert, so they haven't got the right. Lesson number 2, and another reason as to why I'm making this video, is that what's obvious to you can be amazing to others. And this is a philosophy that I've espoused for a long time. I often give productivity advice over the internet, and it's stuff that's very obvious to me because I've been, reading about productivity for like a decade. And yet, if it's the first time or the second time that someone has come across this idea of Parkinson's law or the parable of the Mexican fisherman or whatever, then those can be kind of genuinely game-changing, life-changing insights that were obvious to me, but potentially amazing to other people. Around about 2014, when I was in my 3rd year of university, I had a lot of friends who were really deep into the kind of black and ethnic minority activism and that sort of stuff. And so I had lots of conversations with them about things like race and gender issues. And back in the day, I used to be a little bit annoyed when these friends of mine would, for example, make disparaging comments about white people. And I would say stuff like, hey, look, guys, you're complaining about racism and stuff, but you're being racist to these white people. And they would explain that, no, you can't be racist to white people. You can be prejudiced towards white people. Prejudice is just kind of prejudging someone based on whatever factor. But in order for something to be racism, there has to be a systemic inequality, a systemic power imbalance, which is added to the prejudice. And so in most societies, you can't be racist towards white people. You can be prejudiced, but this power dynamic is not there to subjugate white people. Whereas a white person being racist to a black person, that is prejudice plus a power dynamic, and therefore that makes it racism. The first time I came across that idea, I was like, oh damn, that suddenly makes a lot of things make sense. And while I was still a little bit uneasy about the disparaging comments that friends of mine would make towards white people, I understood that that's not racism. And I first came across this idea in 2014 when a friend of mine kindly explained it. But just yesterday, actually, I was talking to a friend of mine who is also a doctor. He's from an ethnic minority background. And he was using that same argument. He was saying that, hey, look, I get that Black Lives Matter and stuff, but like, aren't black people and Asian people racist against white people? And I said, no. And I explained this like racism and prejudice thing, and I sent him a quote from a book, and he was like, oh, okay, cool, that makes sense. And even though this dude has like lots of black friends and is an ethnic minority and is a doctor and like very well educated and stuff, he just hadn't come across this idea before. And that was just another illustration to me that what's obvious to us can be amazing to others. Like, the first time he'd come across this idea was in the fact that I explained it to him over WhatsApp. And if I hadn't done that, and then that insight wouldn't have happened. And so partly the reason why I'm making a video like this is because there may well be some people watching this who haven't come across the idea of the fact that you can't be racist towards white people, or have often wondered that, but just not taken the steps to find out more about it. And that is why I think it is helpful the more people pile on this. A lot of people, including me, like we have this fear of, I don't want to repost this thing because people will think that I'm just virtue signaling because I haven't talked about this topic in the past before. I haven't experienced overt racism myself personally. And if I post something about Black Lives Matters, or if I repost something on Instagram or whatever, people will think I'm just piling on the bandwagon to virtue signal. Like, fine. I get that fear, and that was a big fear in me before kind of making this video, that what if people just sort of think that, I'm virtue signaling. But the point is, it doesn't actually matter. Like, even if there is one person in the world who comes across an idea through you sharing something about Black Lives Matter, or about race, or about gender, or about anything really, even if there's one person in the world whose mind gets changed as a result of that, or who takes a small step to find out more, that is totally worth the personal, I'm scared of what people will think because people will think I'm just an optical ally, virtue signal, whatever phrase you want to use to worry about that. On that note, lesson number 3 is about self-education. So again, when I was in my third year of university, I had all these friends. We used to talk about gender and race issues a lot. And I would get a little bit annoyed because we'd be having these conversations, and at some point they would check out of the conversation. They would say, oh, I'm not interested in having this discussion with you. I don't want to explain it to you. And I'd be a bit like, oh, okay. I mean, guys, I'm one of the good guys. I want to find out more. I genuinely want to understand your lived experience of this, but you're like choosing not to engage with me on this. Like, come on, like, given that you are the one campaigning for, I don't know, having a curriculum that's more based on Black and ethnic minority people rather than kind of just white authors, given that you're campaigning for all these race and gender issues, surely you should be the one sort of actively interested in explaining it to me. And then, as people explained, and as I read myself, it is not other people's job to educate us. Like, the people who experience and live through racism and sexism and stuff on a daily basis have enough on their plate. Like, there is enough emotional baggage associated with having to kind of change your behavior because you're Black every time you leave the house. There's enough emotional baggage associated with that the people who go through that every day, they don't need another source of emotional baggage in their life of trying to explain it to a skeptic who might be like, oh, well, are you sure that was really racism? Or I'm pretty sure he would have said that even if you're a guy rather than just because you're a girl. And this sort of stuff, which was genuinely kind of I'm embarrassed to say this was my stance towards this sort of stuff up until quite recently. And so lesson number 3 is kind of, I realized that as someone who benefits from male privilege, cis privilege, straight privilege, I can generally pass as white in certain circumstances. I very much sound like a posh white boy. I benefit from so many of these systemic inequalities that is, for me to say that it's my Black friend's job to educate me about racism is a complete myth. It is my job to educate myself about racism, being the one benefiting from the privilege. And if it comes to like productivity or happiness, I'm totally okay with reading productivity books and reading books about Stoicism and Greek philosophy and all this kind of stuff to learn more about it. But for some reason, in the field of racism and sexism and stuff, I thought that, well, it's someone else's job to educate me. I don't need to actively find out more about this myself. And I think that's one of the main points that everyone is kind of going on about by reposting on Instagram, which is fantastic, which is that there are so many things that we can do to educate ourselves about these issues. And we absolutely should. So for me, a few days ago started reading Me and White Supremacy, which is very good, by Layla Saad. And next on my list is why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, which I've heard good things about as well. And watching videos and reading Instagram posts and stuff, like all of these things are self-educational things that we can use. We shouldn't be relying or expecting our friends who are experiencing this sort of systemic oppression, subjugation, racism, sexism, we shouldn't be relying on them to educate us about these issues because it's not their job. They're dealing with enough. They've got enough on their plate. We should educate ourselves about those things. So that's a lesson that I've kind of really begun to appreciate. Lesson number 4 is the idea of tone policing. Now again, when I was in my third year of university, I used to have all these conversations with friends about sex and about race. And I would get annoyed by the fact that they were getting angry or shouting or even sometimes crying about these issues that they were experiencing. And my view of it at the time was, look, why do we have to bring emotion into this? Why do we have to sort of feel so strongly about it? Why can't we just have a sort of logical, dispassionate analysis of exactly why you thought that thing that you experienced was a microaggression or was racism? Because I genuinely want to understand, like no one is doing this stuff from a place of malice. Like it wasn't malice in my heart saying that, your experience doesn't count unless you can recall it logically and without any emotion. But what I was doing was tone policing. And this is one of the chapters in Me and White Supremacy. It's just day 3 out of 30 is when you recognize all of the different aspects of tone policing and why that is such a sort of white privilege, white supremacy way of looking at it. It's us saying to these people that, the content of what you're saying matters less than the tone that you're using. And I want you to use a tone that is unoffensive to me, because only then will I engage with these issues. And here are some examples of tone policing from the book. So I wish you would say what you're saying in a nicer way. I can't take in what you're telling me about your lived experiences because you sound too angry. Your tone is too aggressive. The language you're using to talk about your lived experience is making me feel ashamed. The language you're using to talk about your lived experience is hateful or divisive. You should address white people in a more civil way if you want us to join your cause. The way you're talking about this issue is not productive. If you would just calm down, then maybe I would want to listen to you. You're bringing too much negativity into this space and you should focus on the positive. And the author later goes on to say that, imagine if you experienced an act of violence and then someone asked you to recount that act of violence, that thing that you experienced. And, it would be completely inhumane for them to expect that you don't have any kind of emotional feelings about this, that you're not going to bring emotional feelings into it. She says again, quoting from the book, "This is clearly inhumane. To be human is to feel. To talk about pain without expressing pain is to expect a human to recall information like a robot. When you insist that Black and Indigenous people of color talk about their painful experiences with racism without expressing any pain, rage, or grief, you are asking them to dehumanize themselves. Tone policing is both a request that Black and Indigenous people of color share our experiences about racism without sharing any of our real emotions about it, and for us to exist in ways that do not make white people feel uncomfortable." So yeah, when I read this chapter, just day 3 out of 30, I was like, damn. All of the different examples of tone policing that I've used over the years, just sort of expecting my friends to talk about issues that they're experiencing without expressing any emotion at all, because for some reason I thought that was the way to go about it. So that was kind of lesson number 4 for me, that this tone policing stuff is bad. So if you find yourself doing tone policing, then maybe stop and sort of read more about it, and you'll see all the different examples that it comes up in day-to-day life. And the last lesson I want to talk about is about white centering. And I've sort of known it's a thing for a while. Like we get the, every year in the Oscars, hashtag Oscars so white, like, the underrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic groups in Hollywood, in business, in media, in all sorts of different domains. When something is white, it's kind of seen as the default, to the point where we don't even think about it. Like the example they gave in the book is, imagine listening to a podcast where most of the guests are Black or ethnic minorities. You might ask rightly, well, probably not rightly, you might ask, I wonder if this podcast is really for me, because all the guests are Black and minorities. But now imagine coming across a podcast where most of the guests are white. Like, even if you're an ethnic minority, the thought of maybe this podcast isn't for me because all the guests are white just would not even cross our minds. It is just seen as such a default that the white way is like the right way, the default way. It's just such an intrinsic baked in default into our system that we just wouldn't even think to consider it. Like if a Black or minority ethnic person is reading a book about a white person, where the lead character is white, like, I don't know, Harry Potter, we would never think, I wonder if this book is for me. And yet, if white people are reading a book about a Black lead character, they would think, I wonder if this book is really for me, or if this book is actually written for me, or if it's this kind of pandering to the crowd or whatever. And again, in Me and White Supremacy, she quotes an example of an author who writes a lot of books kind of focused around Black characters, and how in interviews with journalists would ask this author, they would say, when are you going to stop writing books that are about race? And she'd be like, look, man, I'm not gonna, like, one of my aims in life is to make it so that my work does not pander to the white gaze. And white authors like Leo Tolstoy wrote books about white people, those books were about race, but because society as a whole, we don't see white as being a race, we just don't even consider those books about, like, books focused around whiteness as being about race. We only think of non-white things as being about race. So if someone writes a book where a black person is the central character, we would be like, this is a book about race. That's something that I am trying to be more mindful of in terms of the stuff that I read, watch, listen to, because looking at my kind of list of podcasts that I subscribe to, it's all basically white men talking to other white men. So trying to work on that one. Yeah, so those were kind of 5 lessons that I've picked up over the years and more recently about racism. Like I said, I'm not an expert on the topic in the slightest, but I'm trying to become more educated about it. If you're wondering what you can do, then I'll put a load of resources in the video description. Me and White Supremacy, very good book. Well, I'm no longer talking to white people about race. I've heard good things about that. That's next on my to-read list. And yeah, what's next? I don't know. I don't have any answers really. Just thought I'd make this video to share something. And kind of the aim of this video is that if even one person picks up a book about anti-racism or about racism that they wouldn't have before, then that'll be the objective done. So in a few days, we'll return to our regular programming with fairly pointless content related to tech, productivity, and lifestyle. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy and happy. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.